Welcome to EPG Pathshala, subject of Information Technology, in the paper Distributed Application Development. This module is about basic Servlet API. In this module, we will learn about some of the basic interfaces from the javax.servlet package, how to develop a servlet by implementing the Servlet interface which is available here, how to fetch information from the Servlet config and the Servlet context objects which are going to be available. In this module, we will be looking at the Servlet. We already know, in the earlier module, we have already seen the life cycle of a servlet. When in this module, we will be looking at the Servlet interface as a whole, the corresponding interfaces which are used from Servlet, that is we have seen the init method being used in the as the first method of the in the Servlet lifecycle. So, we have the Servlet config object being injected into our Servlet object. So, Servlet config, we would like to explore the methods in the Servlet config. Servlet config makes available to us the Servlet context objects, some of the methods from the Servlet context, how they relate to the some of the information, like we are interested in the information from the web XML file, the deployment descriptor file, fine. So, how to fetch all that information, plus we will like to also explore about the Servlet request, the Servlet response objects, fine. What is the information, how the API related to the Servlet request and the Servlet response, fine. And finally, about creating our first servlet. We will create a servlet which would be just used for giving a very simple response called hello world, fine. So, we would like to create some HTML output which is generating a hello world, fine. So, that is the final output we would like to have in our this particular module, fine. So, let us start by looking at what was that, just let us have a quick review of what was there in the Servlet lifecycle. Okay. In the Servlet lifecycle, we saw about 3 basic methods. What happens first? The first thing which happens is first method which is invoked on servlet. Okay. The first method invoked on servlet is the init method, where parameter is servlet config. Oh, how is this servlet config going to be created? Let us review it again. Okay. So, going through the things happening on the server side. Okay. What happens within the container? As soon as the container is started, identifies the application. For every application, it creates a Servlet context object, fine. This we already know, fine. Now, it creates a Servlet context object, but when it is creating the Servlet context object, it is going through that web.xml file, the deployment descriptor file, using it there. From the Servlet context object, it has read from the deployment descriptor the display name, which is going to be available through the Servlet context object, because this is one per application. The Servlet context is nothing but your web application. The object of Servlet context is your web application. So, if you want to know from the, if anyone who has the Servlet context object wants to know what is the display name used here, it can be picked up by using the Get Servlet context name method. We have a method to get the display name by using the method name is Get Servlet context name, fine. Same way, we had those parameters, right? We had those context parameters going in our web.xml file. If anyone is interested in finding out what are those context params which have been used here, what are the initialization parameters, fine, because someone who deploys the application is setting up his own deployment, is setting up the web.xml file, and he can specify whatever initialization parameter he wants, fine. So, what are all the initialization parameters which have been specified in the web XML file? If you are if that is required to be known, we have our Servlet context interface, providing us with the method called get. There are two important methods here. One of those methods is the get init parameter names. Get init parameter names returns an enumeration of the string. It is nothing but the enumeration containing all the param names for corresponding to all the context param entries. So, if you got 5 different context param entries, the param name in each of them will be available through this enumeration. So, that is a get context parameter names, get init parameter names method available on servlet context. Another method which would be available on servlet context for getting the value of the parameter is, once you know the parameter name, you can use this method called get init parameter. Fine. The parameter required is, it takes one parameter which is nothing but the name of the name of the init parameter. Fine. So, you have that context param and param name. So, if you pass the param name, the corresponding parameter value can always be fetched by using the get init parameter. So, that is a method again on the servlet context. Fine. So, these are some parameters. Fine. This is some of the things which you can use in a servlet context. Fine. Provided you got a servlet context, you can use these methods to fetch the values from the deployment descriptor. Fine. Okay. Proceeding further, when this initialization is done, fine. Yes, these values are set on the servlet context. Another thing which the web container is doing at this time during its startup, it's going through the web XML file, it's going through all those entries. Yes, now it is going through the entries for servlet. So, it has those entries for servlet. For each servlet, it is going to create an object of, we understand, oh, we have a servlet class. So, it is going to create object of that class. Oh, but even before it creates an object of that class, what it is doing is, it is first creating an object of a servlet config. We got another interface called servlet config. Fine. So, an object of servlet config is going to be created. What the object of servlet config would have? We have, see, there is going to be one servlet context per application. Fine. In servlet context, anything specific to the application is available, all those, the initialization parameters, those context param entries, those information is available from servlet context. But we the things which are specific, fine, to the specific to each servlet, for things which are specific to a servlet, we have our servlet config. So, all the servlet config share the same servlet context object. So, if we got 5 different servlet entries in our web.xml file, it has to create 5 different servlet objects, fine. But for corresponding to each of these servlet entries, it would also be creating an object of servlet config, and each config has the servlet context available to them. So, if we have another object here which is nothing but servlet config object. Servlet config has nothing but all the information which is available between servlet and /servlet plus the servlet context. So, if you look at the methods in servlet config, okay. So, servlet config is making available the servlet context, fine. So, this is get servlet context method which returns the servlet context, fine. What is the information between servlet and /servlet? Oh, we have a servlet name, fine. So, this servlet config object created corresponding to a servlet, we have this method called get servlet name to return that servlet name entry, fine. Or this is the name by which the object of servlet was identified, fine. Oh, we have those init param entries, okay. For init param, oh, so for in this servlet config again, we got a method called get init parameter names to return an enumeration of string. Of course, enumeration is being used because this is a very old API. You would have expected some iterator, but fine. It is an old API. This is the specifications were developed long back. So, yes, you still have those legacy interface enumeration being used at so many places in this API. Fine, you will come across that very often. Fine. So, yes, we have our get init parameter names returning a enumeration of string, and also to find if we know the name of a particular parameter, init parameter, we also here also we get the method called get init parameter where you pass the name of a parameter and get it fetch its corresponding value. And so, Servlet config, the methods here, what are the methods in Servlet config? One is get Servlet context. So, the Servlet context which is common which corresponds to our web application, that is available. We got the method called the Get Servlet class, the name of the object for which this the Servlet object is going to be created. We got the init parameter, the init parameter names and the init parameter, fine, the value being available given a parameter, fine. So, these are the methods which we have in the Servlet config, fine. Fine. So, we have Servlet config. So, next step what exactly happens? So, what was happening? Creation of Servlet context for application. For every Servlet entry, Servlet config being created. Also, because there is a Servlet entry, we have mentioned a Servlet class, an object of Servlet is now also being created. And then, yes, and then what happens as soon as a Servlet object is created? The life cycle of the Servlet would start. It begins with the method init, as we know from the lifecycle methods, fine. So, it is during this init that the object of Servlet config is injected into the Servlet object. See, you can understand here the Servlet context, the Servlet config, these are the objects which are coming from the implementer. These are the objects which are coming from who developed those classes. Those are basically interfaces, Servlet context, Servlet config. Who has created those classes? What is their implementation? Oh, that is the implementation which is done by the vendor, the server vendor here. So, for example, if it is Tomcat, yes, there will be something, fine. Those are not the components which the web developer has created, the application developer. See, there are separate roles here, fine. So, the role of a web developer here is different. What is the component which the web developer has created? The web developer is creating the component called the servlet, fine. So, it is now the first lifecycle method called init. What is happening in this? In this, the Servlet config is made available to the servlet. So, it is through this that the web developer actually is getting an object of, fine, our servlet object, whatever the web developer has created, he is basically able to get access into the components, fine, or get access to this container, the components of the container. Servlet config, Servlet context are the components of the container. They are not the components of the developer. When I say developer here, I am referring to the web application developer. Web application developer is writing servlets, he is creating servlets. So, servlet is, so init method important, fine, it is nothing but enabling the interaction from the web from a web application developer to the container. He is able to get access to the components of the various parts of the container through this component. One is, of course, the Servlet config is important to him, but another very important thing is the Servlet context object. It is through this Servlet context object that he will be actually accessing, he is getting access to the entire application, he is getting access and getting his interaction with the container. So, Servlet context, a very important component, is nothing but is enabling interaction with the container, fine, various parts of the container. We will be looking at more methods as we go along, fine, by which we will understand method from Servlet context, by which interaction with the container actually happens here, fine. So, continuing further, so that was the one thing, fine. So, during startup what exactly is happening? Okay, Servlet context creation, Servlet config object creation, Servlet object creation. Initialization is nothing but injecting the Servlet config, enabling the Servlet object with the Servlet config, fine, being injected into it, fine, and fine. And this is something. So, initialization is going to be done on all the Servlet entries. So, corresponding to all the Servlet entries, Servlet object, Servlet config objects being created, all of them getting initialized. Once all this initialization, the various other components which are required and being mentioned in the deployment descriptor, once all of them have been created, it is then, and that too corresponding to all the web applications which are on the server, it is then that the container now becomes ready to start accepting requests from the client. So, we have a huge startup phase, fine, which is nothing but it is during this startup phase of the web container that the init method is getting invoked and all the servlets are ready with their and initialized. Okay. Once the container is ready, fine, the startup phase is over, it is ready to accept request. So, fine. So, now what exactly happens? Now, any URL, any client using a URL, okay, if he uses some URL, it is going to hit the container. Okay. What the container would do? Oh, the container looks up, oh, this is a URL, fine. Oh, do I have some, is it satisfying some URL pattern? Oh, we have those servlet mapping entries, right. So, it will be able to identify, fine, which if it matches any of those URL patterns, if it matches a particular URL pattern, it is able to identify the corresponding servlet. After identifying the servlet, it would also be able to invoke the regular lifecycle method of the servlet, which we already know. The regular lifecycle is nothing but the method called service, fine. But one more thing. Oh, what does the service method require? The service method requires servlet request and servlet response objects as parameters. Oh, these objects, again, these are not the objects of the developer, these are again the objects of the container, fine. The container creates these objects. See what exactly is happening. When the request is arriving, how are they arriving? They are arriving using the HTTP protocol. The container is the one who knows the HTTP protocol, fine. It is not the application developer who has any knowledge of the HTTP protocol, he is not handling the HTTP protocol here at all, fine. The handling of HTTP protocol is done by the container. Container is getting a request over some HTTP fine or whatever protocol, because yes, we are currently looking at the generic part of the Servlet API. So, whatever the protocol may be, fine, the container is able to handle that protocol. It understands that there is a request which is coming according to a specific protocol, fine. So, whenever a request arrives, two things would be done by the container. The container has to create two objects here, fine. It has to manage to be able to create two different objects. One is the object of servlet request and another is the object of servlet response. Oh, what are these two objects? Fine. Considering, let us say, the HTTP protocol being used here, fine, we would have a servlet request object which would be created. It would have nothing but the information which has come as part of the HTTP protocol. All that information would be encapsulated in the object of servlet request. So, that is one object which would be created. The other object, which is the servlet response object, gets created by nothing but allocating a buffer. What the container is doing is, it is allocating a blank buffer, encapsulating it in an object of servlet response. These two objects are then going to be made available to the servlet. The idea of a blank buffer is, yes, the servlet response. What is the servlet response object for? This object is made available to your servlet component. The idea here is, the servlet developer, the web developer here, is not going to be knowing about the HTTP protocol. He does not need to use HTTP protocol to send his response back. He has to simply fill in the content into this buffer. Whatever content he puts into the buffer, it is the container's responsibility to see that it sends this content which is available in the buffer once the service method is over, to send it across back to the client. So, the content is generated by the servlet and put into a buffer, and sending this buffer, sending this content back to the client is the responsibility of the container, and servlet has no role there. The servlet developer has nothing to do with how HTTP works, how that particular protocol works. He simply, the task is very simple for the servlet developer. He is just supposed to put the content there, fine. So, that is the idea here. Of course, before he puts the content, he might like to look at what is the information which has arrived to it from the client, and for that we have the servlet request object. Okay. So, we got to how do I fill the things into my servlet, how do I fill up my buffer, fine. So, we will have methods for those in the servlet response object, in the servlet response interface, and how do I how do I fetch the information which has come from the client? For that we will have methods in the servlet request interface. So, we got those two interfaces, servlet request and servlet response interfaces. Fine. So, let us look into, maybe let us start by looking into what are the methods we will have in the servlet response, because that is going to enable me to put some response back to the client. Okay. So, it is like I am putting the content to a client. So, for this, yes, let us look at this interface here, servlet response. Servlet response has methods for one thing. Oh, this is nothing but a buffer, fine. So, what is the size of the buffer you would like to have, fine. So, for that, yes, we might have a method called, we have the get and set methods for buffer size. So, these are methods in the servlet response, fine. We are looking at now the methods in the servlet response. So, servlet response has methods for getting and setting the buffer size, fine. Okay, fine. Fine. Servlet response has methods for getting and setting the size of the buffer, fine. What else we want? Oh, we want to be able to, because when we are putting some content into the buffer, before we start putting some content to the buffer, we might, it would be a good idea to tell the container what kind of content I am putting there. So, we even have, it is a MIME type, fine. So, we even have a method to get and set the type of content which is being put. So, we have the method like get content type, set content type, fine. In some cases, if you are interested, you could specify even the length there, fine. It is not compulsory. So, you even have get and set method for the content length. So, we got methods for content type, content length, getting and setting them, fine, getting and setting the buffer size. Another important thing here, we have, see, look at this, we have a buffer, right, and we have some mechanism, we will come to that mechanism by which we can start filling things in our content to the buffer. But what happens in case the buffer becomes full? What should happen? Oh, no, nothing, no, it shouldn't result in some error. It is not an error because you exceed your buffer size. Oh, when the buffer becomes full, it would be sending the content back to the, the partial content would already start to moving out to the client, fine. But one thing here, what would happen here is, we have these various settings in our servlet response object, like we had said, oh, what is the content type, what is the content length, fine, what is the character encoding, even character encoding can be said, oh, my character encoding would, because I am sending some text content, oh, then what is the character encoding which I am using here, fine, or whether I am using UTF-8, I am using some other, for any other character setting, fine. So, what is the character encoding, even that, so get set methods are available even for character encoding, fine. So, get character encoding, set character encoding, we got those methods, fine. So, before we set out those, these are settings which are part of the servlet response object. Now, what exactly happens when the is something like this? If the buffer is not full, in that case, it may be that maybe after I have filled in a few things, I might feel that I made some mistake. I would like to change the content type. I would like to change some things. So, when these are some meta information which goes out as part of a response initially, right? It would say this is the content type which is coming, right? That is something which goes to the client first. So, the various settings which we have made in our servlet response object, which are nothing but some meta information about the content, it is not the content, but information about the content. Okay. Now, if the buffer is not full, you are free to make changes there. I might change the character encoding, I might change the content type, I might make some changes there, fine. But if the buffer is full, what would have happened is the metadata information would have moved out. It has been already set to the client that okay, the kind of content which is coming is so and so. Oh, it is a HTML content which is coming, fine, and not an XML, not PDF or something else, fine. It is not an image which is coming, fine. So, you have already set out the content. So, if the buffer is becoming full, fine, and it is like, you know, it has been committed to the client that yes, this is the kind of thing which will go out. In such a case, the state of the response has changed. The response is now said to be in a committed state. The response has become committed. you cannot, once a response is committed, it is a state where we cannot make any more changes to what is the content type. So, the meta information that cannot be changed once the response is committed. So, yes, buffer size has a role there, right? Fine. If the buffer is becoming full, we know things will move out, and once the things has moved out, no changes can be done here. We say the response is committed. We do have a method to check that. We have a method called is committed in the servlet response, fine. And of course, there is another thing which you might like to do. We even have a method called flush buffer. So, if you say flush buffer, oh, it is going to become committed, remember that, fine, you do not have to check again, fine. But yes, you can, of course, anytime you can check whether the buffer is, whether the response has already been committed. The indication of commit means, yes, there is no change possible, fine. We do have method like reset. Oh, we can't reset, or we even have method. See, if I say reset, it would reset the meta information as well as any content which is already put in the buffer, that can always be reset. Or we even have a method which does not change any meta content, fine, but it can only change, it can only reset the buffer. So, we have method like reset, reset buffer, fine, but then okay, fine, reset, reset buffer, those are the methods there. And then the next thing which we might like to do is, we might, okay, now our main interesting area, important thing here was why we need that. So, fine. So, whether reset buffers, those things would not work if the response is already committed, that should be kept in mind. Okay, fine. Now, coming to the important part, the main thing, oh, we want to fill some content into our buffer. So, for content, yes, we might have selected a content type. The content type maybe it is a binary content or is it a text content. If it is a binary content, it would be more appropriate to have an output stream to be able to write the content. We know we have those two types of streams, right, fine. We have our background from Java IO, which indicates that we have those two types of streams, the binary streams and the character streams. So, yes, if the type of content which you are writing is a binary content, you are sending an image there, right, you could be sending image. So, if it is an image, yes, you would have selected a content type to be maybe image slash GIF or image slash JPEG or maybe or any such binary content, in which case it would be appropriate to use an output stream to write into the buffer. See, for writing into the buffer, you do not have, it is not a buffer where you can directly write. You will be provided with the streams which enable you to write into the buffer. So, you have two kinds of streams possible, a binary stream or a text stream. You can have the binary stream with the help of method called get output stream. Get output stream would return to us a servlet output stream, which is a subclass of the output stream, or you could use the method called get writer, which gives us a print writer, which is very simple to use, which we have been using right from the beginning, fine. Right from hello world we have been using the print stream, fine. So, fine. So, according to the type of content which you would like to write, you select your stream and get your stream object like get input stream, get output stream and the get writer. Those are the methods available to give you a stream, and then it is these streams that will be used for writing content into the buffer, fine. So, that is the kind of most of the common methods which are used in the servlet response, fine. Coming to the servlet request, in servlet request, okay, as part of a request, or it is like we are getting information from the client through a request. As part of a request, what will be available? In a request, we might get some parameters, fine. If it is an HTML form being submitted, fine. Oh, we have those forms. In a form, we have those input are there, fine. We have the input tag in HTML, fine. In input tag, we have a name, right. So, that name of an input tag, fine, corresponding to input tag, there is some information being filled out. Okay. So, whenever we have some input tags and a form being submitted, that is coming as a request to the server. Okay. So, as part of HTTP, as part of the servlet request, okay, a servlet request may have parameters. They have parameter have a name and the corresponding value. So, if there is a HTML form being filled out, fine, the name it becomes a parameter name, and whatever value he has put in the form in that field, corresponding field, becomes the value of that parameter, fine. So, that way any number of parameter values may be there, fine. So, it depends on what we have. So, as far as servlet request is concerned, in servlet request again we have methods for fetching those parameters, fine. So, those several methods to fetch those to get those parameter values. So, for example, we have a method called get parameter names to give us an enumeration of a string. So, what are all the different parameters which have been used? We even have a method called get parameter values, and this one, no, it is not returning a single value, it takes the name of a parameter, but returns a array of string. Oh, why do we have an array of string here? When I say get parameter values, is it not a single value? Oh, it can be multiple values here, because the input form which we are submitting can have input tags where the same name has been used by multiple input tags. If the same name is being repeated, the parameter name is same, but it has multiple values available. So, you can always have a form where you have input parameters, input tags having same name, and all those having a particular same name, all the values of that can be available by using this method called get parameter values, which is returning an array of string. Fine. So, that way we have this method to get all the parameter values. Most commonly we have single value, for which you can use the method called get parameter. Fine. You pass a parameter name and get the single value for it. If there are multiple values, it will just give you the first value. Fine. So, you could use that method also, or if you are interested in fetching all of them in a single data structure, we even have a method called get parameter map, which returns a mapping of parameter name and the corresponding string array, all the values corresponding to it. So, that could be another thing which someone might be interested in, going through all the parameters which are submitted in a single data structure of a map type. Fine. So, that is the kind of methods by which you can fetch the parameters from a servlet request. So, servlet request can have parameters, a servlet request can even have content coming from it. So, if there is content, fine, for example, very commonly if you are making an attachment, fine, we are sending attachment, that means a client is also submitting content to a server, right. So, if client is submitting a content to a server, which normally in case of HTTP is coming through a post request. So, if there is content coming from the server, from a client to a server, fine, in the servlet request object, we have methods to fetch that content which has been submitted by a client. So, servlet request would have methods to know the type of the content. We have methods like get content type, get content length, yes, how much is the length of the content, and if you want to read the content, we would have again the option of using the streams. Fine, the option here is if you want to read the content, you will have to use the streams. So, to get us the stream to read, which enable us to read the content from the request. Okay, so, request containing some kind of a content, if you are interested in reading that content, if it is a binary content, we have the servlet input stream available through us by using the method called get input stream, or you could use the method called get reader, which results in returning a buffered reader object. Fine, buffered reader, as we know, has that convenient method called read line, to enable us to read line by line. If it is a text content, fine, which is line based, you could use that method. Fine. So, fine. So, fetching, so in a request you would have parameters, in a request you could have content, fine, okay, fine, fine. So, majorly, yes, most commonly this is what you would be using from the request side, fine. So, we have seen the servlet response, we have seen the servlet request, fine. Servlet request, of course, there are lot many other information which comes. For example, servlet request will have information related to what are the preferences of the user, fine, in terms of what is the locale he likes. Fine. So, we even have method like get locale, fine, to give us what is the locale, what is his preference related to language and country. Fine. So, lot of methods are there, fine, which are available in the servlet request, but the most common thing may be mostly we are most of the time we are interested in what is the parameters being submitted by the user, and if there is content, we are interested in reading the content of the from the client. Fine. So, that would be kind of methods commonly used from that. So, we have seen servlet response, we have seen servlet request, we have also seen servlet config, fine. We have seen servlet context, servlet context corresponding to our application. An important thing here was when we saw the servlet lifecycle, we have only seen 3 methods of servlet. Fine. We have seen the method called init. What does init do? Inject a servlet config object, but one thing which is supposed to be done by a servlet, and servlet is interface here. What is supposed to be done by the implementation of the servlet is whatever servlet config object is injected in the init method must be made available by if anyone wants to know what was the servlet config which was given to this servlet object. So, there is a separate method which is not a lifecycle method, but it has to be made available and implemented by anyone who implements the servlet interface. There is this method called get servlet config. It's not only init method. So, in the init method you will have a servlet config object being created, injected into the servlet instance, but we should be also making a method, we should also write an implementation method which will be returning the servlet config. So, this normally is managed by keeping one instance variable which you initialize in the init method. Fine. There is another method which is an additional method being part of the servlet interface. We have this method called Get Servlet Info. This is a simple method which someone can just simply implement to return some copyright and some such information, anything which the developer, the servlet developer would like to return related to the information about the servlet. Normally what is returned is a copyright message, that is what is normally returned as implementation of the Get Servlet Info. Fine. So, servlet has 5 methods. Fine. What we have seen, servlet config 4 methods, get servlet context, get init parameter names, get init parameter, get servlet name. Servlet has 5 methods, 3 of those were the lifecycle methods, init method with servlet config as parameter, service method with servlet request, servlet response as parameter, destroy method without any parameter. These 3 were the lifecycle methods which we had seen earlier, and 2 additional method. One is the method where we return the servlet config object, and other is the get servlet config, other is the get servlet info method. Fine. Okay. So, now we understand there are 5 methods in our servlet interface. Okay. So, now we also have seen methods of servlet response. Now, as a first exercise, what we might do here is we would be interested in writing some kind of a servlet and seeing how it is going to be deployed in as part of a web application. So, for that let us take a small exercise. Let us do this exercise where we will be writing an implementation of a servlet. How do we write that implementation of a servlet? Fine. Which would simply, we are not going to do anything on the servlet request here. Fine. We are not going to look into what is there in the servlet request, but we are interested in using the servlet response because we want to give a fixed response here. We are not looking into anything else here. So, fine. For this, let us see how do we write how do we specify how do we write our first servlet object. Fine. So, for that, yes, let us write an implementation here. So, if you want to write, so let us begin by writing a class here. Fine. So, we begin here by using this class. Okay. So, you can write you can have your own packet declaration. Fine. For example, what we will do here, okay, let us use our package name as what, org.epgpathshala.servlet. Fine. So, let us keep that as our package name. We will need import statements for, so we will have an import for javax.servlet.star. Fine. We will have another import which is import for java.io.star. Yes, we will be using the streams. Fine. And fine. So, that should be the import statement, and then we can begin with our class definition. So, let us begin with the class definition. We will say, okay, so here what we have is public class. It should be a public, a few requirements of the servlet. Your servlet must be a public class, and whatever servlet you write must have a default constructor available. And the reason, the creation is not your job, the creation is to be done by the container. So, these are the requirements which are to be satisfied for the container to be able to create your object of your class. So, when we write our class, we will be writing it always as a public class. So, it should be a public class. So, in our case here we write our class as public class hello servlet. It implements the servlet. So, we will have an implementation of implements servlet. Fine. Within this, we recollect we have to write the implementation of get servlet info, and therefore, we declare one private variable to keep the servlet config object. Fine. So, we have private servlet config, let us call it as config, variable name as config. So, that is one variable we will have, that is the only one we will keep here, and then we will need to write implementation of those 5 methods of the interface. Fine. So, first method init method. So, we have the public void init, parameter is servlet config. What do we do here? A servlet config is being injected, fine, we will store it in our config object. So, this is nothing but this dot config equals to the parameter name here is config, fine, we use that, fine. So, this dot config is config. So, that is what goes in the init method, fine, we will not do anything much in the init method, fine. If there was a requirement of using those context param or any such thing, maybe that normally would be done here, fine, we would have some code here, but in our case this is hello servlet, very simple thing, fine. So, that is the implementation of our first method, which is the init method. Second method, the most important one, or let us finish off with the simpler one. We have to write up that method called get servlet config, that is quite simple here. We will have public return type servlet config, get servlet config method, fine. What is the code there? Return this dot config, fine. The config would have been initialized in the init method, fine. So, we simply here the code is simple, get servlet config implementation is to return the config object, fine. Third one, again another simple one, fine, we can keep it as what? Get servlet info, so it returns a string, fine. So, this implementation can be return, and we can say copyright EPG Pathshala, fine, and the year 2015, fine. So, let us keep that returning, and of course, the name of the servlet, that is hello servlet. So, hello servlet, copyright and EPG Pathshala and the year, fine. So, that can be our implementation of get servlet info, fine. And then the destroy method, fine. So, we are finishing off with the easier ones first. So, we can do the destroy method. In the destroy, we do not want to do anything here, fine. So, we can have a blank implementation of public void destroy, nothing being done. The important one, the main method, the regular lifecycle method, that is the service method being used, fine. So, we have our public void service, 2 parameters. First one is servlet request, let us use a variable name request. Second is servlet response, variable name as response, fine. Now, the methods which we are going to here use within this may have a throws for IO exception, and there is another exception which may also be thrown, that is the servlet exception. So, this method has a throws for IO exception and servlet exception. Now, let us go about it. What we want to do here? A simple thing, each time a request, we are not going to look at what is coming in the request. Our interest is to give a fixed response, which is nothing but which should result in a hello world being displayed in the browser, fine. So, for that, yes, what is the first thing to be done? First thing to be done is we need to specify, we will work only on the response object now, because we are interested in putting the response there. So, first thing, we have the second parameter as a response. So, we start working on it. So, on the response object, we will set the content type. We are going to set content type as, we are going to send a HTML content. So, we will say response dot set content type, and we will put the content type as text / HTML, fine. Next line, now we may forget about all other settings, fine. Let us go with the default settings straight away. Let us try to start putting content into the buffer. So, in order to put content into the buffer, in this case it is a text output which we have, it is a text content, and therefore, we will use a Printwriter, fine. So, we use Printwriter, let us call the variable name as out equals response dot get writer. So, this will give us a Printwriter object which is enabling us to put the content into our buffer, fine. And then on this out object we will say out dot println, within double quotes is the HTML content which will be HTML, fine, then title, head, yeah, of course the head, then title, fine, title can be hello servlet, fine, and then slash title slash head, fine. Next line we can put it out as, okay, the next line out dot println again, and in this we will say body, fine, and we can put simple h1 hello world slash h1 slash body slash html out dot println this, and that is it. The service method is over, fine. So, we do not need anything much here, fine. So, that is the way we have written our implementation of the servlet. Once you have finished implementing the servlet, what we need to do is compile this, put this under the classes, fine. So, when you compile, give the destination as -d, specify the classes folder which is under the web-inf, fine, under web. So, you have your application folder maybe. So, if we call this application as sample, we will have a folder called sample, within which we will have a web-inf folder where we have a classes folder. So, the destination is the classes, fine. So, when you compile, use the -d option to specify destination as classes. So, within classes the package structure would be created, class file will be available, fine. So, once we have this, fine, we generate the class file. We will now need to put and create the web.xml file. In the web XML file, yeah, we know web app slash web app, display name, let us call it as sample application. Okay. Currently in this application we have no initialization parameter, so we are not putting any context parameters, fine, but we are going with one servlet, or maybe we can create two instances of the servlet, fine. So, maybe we have one servlet, servlet name. So, we have servlet with servlet name as hello, fine. Servlet class, yes, what was the package name? We had the package name as org.epgpathshala.servlet.hello servlet, that was the name of the class, fine. So, that goes as a servlet class, fine. We are not using any init parameters here, fine. If you want, you can put init on startup, or even if we skip, that is fine for this for this particular case here, fine. So, we have our servlet entry like this. Another servlet if you want, you can create, give it a different name, let us call it as hi, use the same class name here, okay. So, we got two different servlet objects. Now, let us put some servlet mapping, fine. So, we can try out all the three kinds of servlet mappings, okay. So, we have a servlet mapping with servlet name as servlet name, one was hello, the other is hi, fine. So, here we use, let us say, with hello URL pattern, maybe you would like to say URL pattern is slash fine, what you will put, okay, slash hello, let us keep it slash hello H capital here, fine. So, that is one, okay. So, that is one servlet mapping. Another servlet mapping we will put as where we use the servlet name as hi, okay, and URL pattern maybe we will say slash hi slash star, okay. So, anything which is slash, so the URL to be used to access this would be host name slash sample, because that is the application name, slash hi slash, you can use anything, you can use any extent of the path you like, okay, fine. So, that is another thing which you can put in the another mapping. A third mapping, maybe you can repeat one of those components, maybe I want to use hello again, fine. So, you can say another would be servlet mapping with servlet name as hello again, fine. So, first one was hello, second was hi, and I am repeating the servlet component as hello, but a different URL pattern. The different URL pattern is simply saying a pattern which says URL pattern is star.hello, fine. So, I have three different URL patterns with three different servlet mappings being created, though I have only two servlet components, fine. And both of them are using actually a single servlet class. Oh, that is fine, fine. So, let us deploy this. So, we will deploy this and then we run this. Okay. So, if we put this here, fine. Oh, how do we deploy it? If it is Tomcat, within Tomcat there is one folder called web apps. So, put the folder within the web apps folder, maybe just restart Tomcat. After having restarted Tomcat, go to a browser and put this http:// the IP address of where the server is, where the Tomcat is running, :880. Oh, by default Tomcat would start on port 880 / Oh, we have our application deployed by the name of sample. So, /sample/ and then try out those 3 different URL patterns and the thing should work fine. So, I think just try this out and fine. So, that is the first thing. So, in this module we have seen all the how to create and deploy a simple servlet. So, in summary, in this module we have seen how to develop a servlet by implementing the servlet interface and how to deploy it in a web container like Tomcat. Fine. In the next module, we will be exploring more classes and interfaces from the javax.servlet package. Okay. So, thank you friends.